The U.S. Army tried to kick this man out 8 different times, but on a cold morning in 1944, he became the only thing standing between 35 dying soldiers and 700 advancing Germans. The man's name was Jake McNiss, 25 years old, a mohawk carved into his head, black war paint across his face, and the worst discipline record in his entire division, a reject, a troublemaker, a soldier nobody wanted. But on this day, he was the only hope they had. His platoon of 35 paratroopers had been stranded for days, no food, no water, no ammunition resupply. Some men were so desperate they were eating grass just to stay alive, and the only bridge they could have escaped across. American planes had accidentally blown it up hours earlier. Then 7:22 a.m. A German officer walked toward them carrying a white flag, but this wasn't a surrender. This was an invitation for them to surrender. From the German point of view, the battle was already over. 700 well-armed soldiers vs 35 starving Americans. There was no contest. Jake McNiss stepped forward. He looked at the sea of German rifles. He looked back at his 35 exhausted men, men who could barely stand, but who trusted him anyway, and Jake made a decision no one expected, a decision that would enter military legend, and told the officer 3 simple words: if you want it, come take it. 3 days later, over 100 Germans were dead or wounded. Jake's men, 0 casualties, and here's the part almost nobody knows. Why a soldier the army kept trying to expel became the man who broke a German force 20 times his size. By the end of this story, you'll understand why. Before Jake McNiss ever faced 700 German soldiers, he had already spent years fighting a very different enemy, the U.S. Army itself. Not because he was a traitor, not because he was lazy, but because Jake had a rule he lived by from the moment he entered the service. I follow orders that make sense. The rest, no. Wow. Jake grew up in the middle of Oklahoma during the Great Depression. 10 kids and a family that survived on whatever the land gave them. He learned to shoot before he could drive, learned to hunt before he could spell half the words in his school books, and learned early that life didn't reward people who waited politely. By 19, he was a firefighter running into burning buildings, while most men his age were still figuring out how to swing a hammer. So when Pearl Harbor was attacked, Jake didn't wait for a draft notice. He volunteered not for patriotism, not for speeches, not for medals. He volunteered for the paratroopers because they got dropped behind enemy lines with explosives, and Jake liked explosives. The Army sent him to Fort Benning for basic training. On his very first week, his commanding officer asked if he understood military discipline. Jake said, sure. It downed. The very same morning in the mess hall, a staff sergeant stole Jake's butter ration and told him to sit down and shut up. Jake warned him once. The sergeant laughed. Jake broke his nose. That incident alone should have ended his military career. But here's where the first major contradiction of Jake's life appeared. Every time he got in trouble, he also did something spectacular. Later that same day, yes, the same day he punched the sergeant, Jake set a base record on the demolition course, the fastest anyone at Fort Benning had ever run it. The instructors were furious at him and impressed with him at the same time, which would become the theme of his entire career. He refused to call officers sir unless they'd earned it. He ignored formations. He ignored salutes. He ignored any rule that didn't help him kill the enemy faster. When a lieutenant finally snapped and asked Jake why he couldn't behave like a normal soldier, Jake replied, I'm here to kill Nazis, not polish boots. If you razz. And about that line made its way around the base faster than a rumor at a high school. But it also forced the brass to confront a new problem. Jake wasn't just difficult. He was too good to throw away. He shot better than nearly everyone. He ran farther than nearly everyone. He could ruck with 60 lb for miles without slowing down. And during hand-to-hand training, there were instructors who quietly hoped Jake wouldn't get paired with them. So instead of kicking him out, the Army tried something unusual. They isolated him. They gave him his own platoon, his own barracks, his own little corner of the 101st Airborne, mostly so he wouldn't infect the rest of the division with his attitude. And whenever another soldier showed Up who also couldn't follow the rules, the brawlers, the troublemakers, the men who were brilliant in combat and hopeless everywhere else. The army shipped them straight to Jake. Within months, he had collected 12 misfits, each one more unmanageable than the last. A coal miner who broke 3 MP noses in one bar fight. A 4-language black market runner from New York who could interrogate prisoners better than officers, twice his rank. A demolitions fanatic who blew up a latrine just to see the pattern. IDs, a boxing champion from Chicago who won 14 fights in basic training. All of them documented. Together they became known as the Filthy 13, dirty, disobedient chaos in uniform and the best-performing platoon in Fort Benning. They shot better, ran harder, fought longer, and ignored every social rule the army had. Jake didn't pretend he was building good soldiers. He was building a pack, a group bound not by salutes and protocols, but by one rule. Be damn good at your job or get out, and officers hated it. Some wanted Jake court-martialed. Some wanted him studied. Most wanted him transferred far, far away. But here's the part almost nobody realizes. Every time Jake broke a rule, he proved another one useless, and the army, especially the officers who actually had to win battles, started to notice. This is the foundation for everything that comes next. Because before Jake ever faced 700 Germans, the army had already discovered one thing. They couldn't control him, but they couldn't replace him either. Jake didn't build the Filthy 13 on purpose. The army built it for him by accident. Every time a troublemaker showed up at Fort Benning, every time a soldier refused to follow orders, every time someone punched the wrong person or broke the wrong rule, officers looked at their clipboard, sighed, and said the same thing. Send him to MCN. At first, it was a punishment. Then it became a pattern. Eventually, it became a pipeline. And within 6 months, Jake had a platoon so chaotic that officers avoided their barracks like it was a plague house. Let's talk about the men the army accidentally handed him. There was Jack W.H. Murr, a Pennsylvania coal miner built like a piece of mining equipment. Jack once got in a fight with 3 military policemen at once over a poker game and broke all 3 of their noses. No weapons, no warning, just 3 broken faces. He turned out to be the best marksman in the entire 101st Airborne. Then there was Charles Plow, a 4-language immigrant from New York. He spoke English, Italian, French, and German. He also ran a black market ring, secretly selling army supplies to civilians. Instead of throwing him in jail, the army realized he could interrogate prisoners better than anyone, so they sent him to Jake. Next was Robert Kahn from Tennessee, a demolitions expert with the curiosity of a scientist and the judgment of a 10-year-old. He blew up a latrine, not out of anger, not by accident, but because he wanted to see what the explosion pattern would look like. When you dud, the army didn't even yell at him. They took one look at his report and transferred him straight to Jake. Then you had Joe Alishwitz, Chicago street fighter, a man whose fists had their own service record. He got into 14 fist fights during basic training, won all 14. The instructors simply gave up and sent him to Jake. And these were just the first few. Every one of them had the same problem. Too talented to discharge, too wild to put with regular troops. To everyone else, they were headaches. To Jake, they were perfect. Because Jake understood something that most officers, even good ones, never learned. Obedience and discipline are not the same thing. Obedience is about doing exactly what you're told. Discipline is about doing what needs to be done. Jake didn't want obedient men. He wanted men who could crawl through mud, move without being heard, shoot straight under pressure, and improvise when everything went wrong. Men who wouldn't freeze when a plan collapsed or when orders stopped making sense. So he trained them like warriors, not soldiers. No parade drills, no shiny boots, no useless formalities. The Filthy 13 ran farther than any other platoon. They carried more weight. They fought harder during sparring. They shot until their shoulders etched. They did so many ruck marches that other units started timing themselves against MC Pack. Work side. Jake ran the platoon like a wolf pack. Not a chain of command. There were no fancy ranks, no yelling contests. Only one question mattered. Can you pull your weight? Neither do I. If a man couldn't, Jake didn't file paperwork. He didn't complain to an officer. He simply walked the guy to the edge of the field and told him to go join a different platoon, brutal but effective. And here's the strange thing. The Army hated everything Jake was doing, but they couldn't argue with the results. Whenever the 101st Airborne held qualification tests, marksmanship, demolitions, hand-to-hand combat, endurance, Jake's misfits finished at the top every single time. The only category they failed consistently, uniform inspections, because none of them cared. Word spread fast. Other soldiers came to watch them train. Officers argued about them in the mess hall. Some wanted the whole platoon court-martialed. Others wanted to study how Hell McNess kept turning rejects into elite performers, but Jake didn't see any magic in it. To him, it was simple. If you build a team of men who aren't afraid to question orders, aren't afraid to fight dirty, and aren't afraid to push themselves to the edge, you end up with a group that can survive situations the Army never prepared them for. Situations like jumping into Normandy at midnight, fighting hundreds of German troops with no supplies, and holding the line when the entire front collapses. The officers at Fort Benning had no idea yet, but the Army's trash pile platoon was about to become one of the deadliest teams in the European theater, and Jake McNess, the man they tried to throw away, was about to lead them into the most violent night in modern history. For most soldiers, basic training ends when the instructors sign the paperwork. For Jake's men, it ended when the Army finally admitted something it hated to admit. These lunatics are out, performing everyone, but the Army still had hope. Hope that eventually Jake would slip so badly they could get rid of him once and for all. They didn't have to wait long. One night before deployment, Jake and his men went into a bar near Fort Benning. They were off-duty, off-base, and miracle of miracles behaving themselves. Then 2 MP walked in. The moment they saw Jake's men, they decided to make an example. One MP grabbed one of Jake's paratroopers, tried to arrest him for being drunk and disorderly. Jake stood up and asked a simple question. Is there a problem? The MP told him to sit down and shut up. Jake broke his jaw. Then he broke the second MP jaw. Calm, clean, efficient, like switching off 2 lights. He took both of their Colt 911 pistols, walked outside, and emptied all 16 rounds into a street sign just to cool off. Then he walked back inside, sat down, and waited for the MP to wake up so he could turn himself in. He didn't run, he didn't argue, he didn't hide, he just waited. The MP dragged him to his commanding officer. The officer opened Jake's file. 8 disciplinary write-ups, multiple assaults, constant insubordination. On paper, Jake was done. Court-martial, discharge, career over. But here's where Jake's life takes another sharp turn. Instead of ending his service, the officer made Jake an offer so ridiculous that even Jake blinked. There was an old record. A 136, my march from Fort Benning to another base. Almost nobody had ever completed it. If Jake and his men attempted the march, the officer would ignore the entire MP incident. Jake said yes immediately, but then he added a condition. He would march all 136 mi in full combat gear without changing his socks and without getting a single blister. The officer burst out laughing. Impossible, he said. Jake looked him in the eye. Watch me. 10 days later, Jake completed the full 136 mi. 60. L.B. Ruck. Boots caked in mud, not one blister. Army doctors were stunned. Jake's explanation: he'd been walking since he was 10 years old. His feet were tougher than boot leather. The officer kept his word. The charges vanished. But the moment the ink dried, problems began again, this time in England. The British had rules. Jake had none. When the filthy 13 crossed the Atlantic in early 1944, they stepped into a country drowning in rationing, meat, rare, sugar, strictly limited, hunting or fishing, illegal without permits, poaching a criminal offense. Jake looked at the British rations, then looked at the countryside full of deer, rabbits, birds, and rivers stocked with fish. He decided the British rules were optional. He took his M1 Gare and into the fields and hunted like it was Oklahoma. He used military explosives to fish streams. He set traps behind British farms using skills he'd learned as a boy. Within weeks, his platoon was eating better than most officers. They were also breaking somewhere around 47 British laws. One furious landowner filed a lawsuit against the U.S. government, complaining that American soldiers were stealing his game. Jake's commanding officer summoned him. "Are you responsible for this?" Jake didn't even blink. "Yes, my men need real food if you want them to jump into France and kill Germans." The officer rubbed his forehead. "What do you expect me to do?" "This is a serious legal complaint." Jake shrugged. "Well, you could send me on a suicide jump into German territory. I don't mind that, and that was it. You can't threaten a man with danger when danger is why he enlisted." Jake avoided punishment again, and then the photographer showed up. In the first week of June, 1944, just days before D-Day, Jake shaved his hair into a mohawk and painted white war stripes across his face. His men followed with their own twists. A Stars and Stripes photographer saw them, snapped a few pictures, and unknowingly created one of the most iconic images of World War II paratroopers. Jake didn't do it for attention. He did it because war paint made him feel ready. The Army had no idea that the chaotic, rule-breaking platoon they kept trying to hide was about to become the most famous group of paratroopers in the European theater. And they had even let idea that within 48 hours Jake would fall out of a burning plane into the most violent night of his life. By the time Jake and the Filthy 13 landed in England, their reputation had already crossed the Atlantic ahead of them like a warning label. The British expected polished American troops, clean boots, crisp salutes, polite manners. What they got instead was Jake's platoon. 12 men who looked like they had crawled straight out of a bar fight and into a uniform. And England, unlike Fort Benning, had rules. Real rules. National rules. Meat was rationed. Butter was rationed. Sugar was rationed. Even owning more than a certain amount of flour could get a man fined. Hunting illegal without a permit. Fishing with explosives, absolutely not. Jake took one look at the British ration portion, small, pale, and heartbreaking, then stepped outside the base, breathed in the countryside air, and announced his official opinion: "This isn't food." To Jake, the farms, forests, and rivers of England looked exactly like Oklahoma, with fewer snakes and more deer, which meant opportunity. So he went out with his M1 Garand and hunted. He set traps for rabbits and pheasants. He used demolition charges to fish rivers, sending shock waves that brought fish floating to the surface. His men followed him like a pack. Explosives here, snares there, fresh meat roasting behind the barracks. Within 2 weeks, the Filthy 13 were eating better than most British officers, and far better than any American unit on the island. They were also breaking what felt like half the laws in Yorkshire. The tipping point came when a wealthy landowner marched onto the American base demanding justice. He claimed that U.S. soldiers were poaching his deer, his rabbits, and possibly half the trout in his river. He wanted compensation. He wanted arrests. He wanted someone's career. Jake's commanding officer, already exhausted from dealing with the platoon, summoned him. "Jake, did you or your men hunt on this man's property?" "Yes," Jake said. "They need protein if you want them to fight." "That's illegal. So is losing a war," Jake answered. The officer tried again, slower this time. "What am I supposed to do? He's threatening legal action," Jake shrugged. "You could send me on a suicide jump into occupied France. I'd be fine with that." The officer stared at him for a solid 10 seconds, realizing again that trying to punish Jake was like trying to punish a tornado. You don't discipline it. You just try to point it in the right direction and pray it goes that way. The British landowner eventually gave up when he realized the American military had absolutely zero interest in arresting its best killers over a deer carcass. But trouble wasn't the only thing following Jake around. So was attention. The photo that turned them into legends. In early June, just days before D-Day, Jake made a decision that would accidentally stamp his face into World War II history. He shaved his hair into a mohawk. Then he painted white war stripes across his cheeks, like a man walking into a ritual, not a war. His men took the idea and ran with it. Some shaved their heads completely. Some added extra markings, and one painted a skull across half his face. A Stars and Stripes photographer happened to walk by. He saw 13 men who looked less like soldiers and more like warriors from a lost tribe. He snapped a few pictures. Those photos would become the most famous images of American paratroopers in the entire war. Used in documentaries, books, museums, and military posters for decades, Jake didn't care about any of that. To him, the war paint had one purpose: to remind himself that once he jumped from that plane, he wasn't the man from Oklahoma anymore. He was whatever the mission needed him to be. Behind the paint, behind the mohawks, behind the chaos and broken rules, Jake had a single focus: get in, kill the enemy, bring my men home. In less than 48 hours, Jake would put that philosophy to the ultimate test, because the plane carrying him into Normandy was about to explode in midair. On the night of June 5th, 1944, Jake and his men climbed aboard their C-47 transport. Painted like warriors, Mohawks cut sharp white war stripes across their faces like ghosts, preparing for a hunt. No one talked, no one joked. The filthy 13 caused chaos everywhere except here. Right before combat, they became silent predators. Jake stood by the door, harness clipped, static line ready. He had told his men one thing before takeoff: once we jump, you stop being who you were. You become what the mission needs. Works. At 11:47 p.m., the plane roared down the runway and lifted into the dark. Somewhere across the channel, Normandy waited, still quiet, still unaware of what was coming. For an hour, the flight was steady. Quiet engine hums they would never admit. Then at 1:23 a.m., the French coast appeared beneath them and the sky lit up. First a few flashes, then dozens, then hundreds. The Germans had spotted the formation. 88mm flak guns began firing, turning the night sky into a storm of exploding fireballs. Tracer rounds clawed upward like red, hot claws raking the darkness. Shrapnel hammered the fuselage. The C-47 shook violently. Hook up. The jumpmaster yelled. Jake and his men clipped their static lines onto the cable overhead. The red light glowed. The plane lurched again harder. The jumpmaster braced himself against the wall, trying to stand upright. And then, without warning, the world turned white. At 1:26 a.m., an 88mm shell hit the fuel tank. The explosion tore the aircraft apart. Fire rushed through the cabin. The tail section ripped away. Men who weren't clipped in were thrown into the night sky like ragdolls. The plane stopped being a plane and became debris scattered across the air. Jake was standing in the door when the blast hit. The force blasted him backward out into open air. He didn't even feel the wind at first, just shock, heat, and weightlessness. His static lines snapped tight, yanking his parachute open, but it wasn't a clean deployment. One panel was on fire. Two others were shredded by flak. Jake spun uncontrollably, dropping fast, unable to steer. He was falling straight toward a flooded marsh. He hit the water hard. The impact knocked the air out of him, and his gear dragged him under instantly. The harness wrapped around his legs like vines. Most paratroopers who landed like that drowned in seconds. Jake didn't panic. Panic wastes us oxygen. He forced his knife out, cut the tangled harness, and kicked upward through cold black water. He broke the surface, gasping, just as flaming debris from the exploding aircraft splashed into the marsh around him. He was alive, barely, but alive all around him. The night was chaos. Burning planes spiraled down. Chutes drifted into German positions. Machine guns cracked in the dark. Explosions echoed across Normandy. Jake fumbled for his rifle, pulled it out of the water, and checked it. Soaked but usable, he didn't stop. He started moving. For hours, Jake crawled, sprinted, and cut through hedge searching for survivors. He found them one by one: Jack W.H., Murr, Pla, Con Alishvitz, a few more. 9 men total, 4 were dead. The rest were scattered across the countryside. 9 survivors. Jake gathered them in a ditch. Faces streaked with mud, smoke, and war paint washed half away. Then he told them the mission: we're taking the bridge at Chef Dupont. We hold it. No Germans get through. Scale. Intelligence said at least 200 German troops defended the area. Jake had 9. He didn't hesitate. We attack anyway. 6:34 a.m. Jake's tiny group began hunting through the hedgerows. They ambushed patrols, hit German lines, vanished before the enemy even understood what was happening. The Germans never suspected 9 men were attacking 200 by 9. A.M. scattered American paratroopers. Men from other units linked up With Jake, 9 became 35. By 11 a.m., after a string of fast ambushes and shocking German confusion, Jake's 35 men captured the bridge at Chef Dupont, but the victory didn't last long. At 4:43 p.m., American P-47 Thunderbolts screamed overhead. Jake's men waved their helmets, shouted, signaled. Planes circled once, then they bombed the bridge. American pilots, acting on outdated orders, destroyed the very objective Jake's men had risked their lives to take. The bridge exploded into rubble. The structure collapsed into the river. The mission they had fought all morning for vanished in seconds. Jake watched the bridge fall, then started laughing, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly the kind of mistake he expected from the army. His men stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Jake shook his head and explained calmly. They were cut off, no bridge, no reinforcements. And hundreds of Germans were grouping on the far bank. There was no escape now. There was only one choice: turn the high ground into a fortress and make the Germans pay for every inch they tried to take. Jake studied the terrain, saw the choke points, and began positioning his machine guns and riflemen. 35 starving Americans, 700 Germans coming for them. Jake didn't flinch. Get ready, he said. They're coming. Jake didn't choose the high ground above the destroyed bridge because it was dramatic. He chose it because it was mathematically lethal. There were 3 narrow approaches leading up the slope, thin paths between trees, hedgerows, and natural embankments. Any soldier trying to climb them would be forced into tight bunches, and bunched up soldiers to fast. Jake understood this instantly. He didn't need a map. He didn't need a briefing. He walked the ridge once, looked at the terrain, and saw exactly what it was: a funnel, a choke point, a killing ground. He placed his 2 .30-caliber machine guns so their fields of fire overlapped, meaning every German who tried to climb would be hit from multiple angles. He put his best riflemen in elevated openings with wide sight lines. The job was simple: shoot the leaders first, kill the officers, kill the encasses, cut the head off the snake. He positioned his bar gunners to suppress German machine gun teams and mortar crews, the only real threats to his defensive line. Then he picked 5 men to act as a mobile reserve. If Germans broke through anywhere, that 5-man squad would hit the breach immediately. 35 men perfectly placed and starving and exhausted and surrounded. But their positions were perfect, and Jake knew it. We hold here, he said, no matter what they send. The Germans arrive. On the morning of June 7th, German scouts spotted American paratroopers dug in on the high ground. They reported back. On June 8th, the Germans tested Jake's defenses with small probing attacks, squad-sized pushes, moving cautiously up the slope. Jake's men killed every one of them. Clean, controlled bursts, not wasting a single bullet. The Germans pulled back again, and they regrouped. The real attack came the next morning, the white flag at 7:22 a.m. On June 9th, a German officer rode forward under a white flag, not to surrender, but to demand it. He walked straight through the burned-out ruins of the bridge up toward the hill where Jake stood. He explained the situation calmly, almost kindly. Jake had 35 men. He had 700. He had machine guns, artillery, fresh water, supplies, reinforcements. Jake had none of that. Logic, math, and common sense all pointed in one direction: surrender. Jake listened, not because he was considering it, but because he wanted to hear the man finish his speech so he could respond properly. When the German was done, Jake pointed at the slope behind him and said, "If you want to come up this hill, start climbing." The officer blinked, walked back, mounting his horse again, and signaled the attack. Wave 1, 200 Germans at 9:14 a.m. The first wave began. 200 German infantrymen advanced uphill in tight formation, exactly the way Jake expected. Jake didn't give the order to fire, not yet. He let them come closer, closer, closer. The Germans hit the first choke point and bunched up like cattle in a funnel. Then Jake raised his hand. Fire! The hill erupted. The 30-cal machine guns unleashed hell, 500 rounds per minute each, cutting through the German front ranks like a blade slicing cloth. Riflemen followed with precise, disciplined shots. Every man had trained for this moment, fast aiming, no wasted rounds. German soldiers stumbled, dropped, crawled for cover that didn't exist. The slope was bare, the angle steep. There was nowhere to hide. The wave collapsed in minutes. Dozens dead or wounded. the remainder retreating down the hill in panic. Jake's casualties 0, Wave 2, mortars and infantry. The second German attack came late in the morning, this time with mortars. Shells crashed along the ridge in heavy arcs. Explosions ripped bark off trees, chewed dirt into the air, and shook loose stones from the slope. But Jake had placed his men behind the crest of the hill on the reverse slope. The mortars hit the forward slope loud, terrifying, impressive, but almost completely ineffective. When the barrage stopped, another 200 Germans advanced. Jake let them come again. They hit the same choke points. They bunched up, and Jake's machine guns opened again. The second wave lasted barely 5 minutes. Another 50 Germans dead or wounded. American casualties 0, Wave 3 artillery and 2 tanks. By mid-afternoon, German commanders were furious. They brought artillery. Then they brought armor to Panzer IV tanks rolling up the main road. Infantry clustered behind them. Jake watched through binoculars. He knew he couldn't kill the tanks. No bazookas, no anti-tank weapons, no explosives big enough to punch through armor. But he saw something the Germans didn't. The tanks had only one route, a narrow defile between 2 hills. If they stayed on the road, they had no angle to shoot upward at Jake's positions. And if they left the road, they'd sink into the mud and be useless. So Jake issued a simple order: ignore the tanks, kill the infantry. When the tanks reached the defile, Jake's machine guns opened, not at the armor but at the infantry. Using the tanks as shields, German soldiers fell immediately, scrambling for cover that wasn't there. The tanks rumbled forward alone, blind, without support, firing 75 mm shells that could not elevate high enough to reach the reverse slope. Thunderous blasts tore into the forward hill. Dirt erupted, trees shattered, but Jake's men stayed untouched behind the crest. After 30 minutes of useless shelling, both tanks pulled back. Jake's casualties after 3 waves, artillery, mortars, tanks, still 0. The Germans break. By nightfall on June 9th, German attack had failed 5 separate times. Over 100 Germans were dead, hundreds more wounded. Jake's men had not lost a single soldier. When reinforcements from the 82nd Airborne finally reached the hill on June 10th, they found 35 exhausted, starving paratroopers still holding the high ground mud on their faces, grass stuck in their teeth, and not a single man missing. A relief officer asked Jake for his casualty count. Jake answered 0, but if you brought food, we'll take it. Most battles have a turning point, a moment where one side realizes the fight is lost. At the hill above the destroyed bridge, that moment never came for Jake's men. They were too stubborn, too hungry, too angry to notice they were supposed to die. For the Germans, however, that moment arrived slowly, wave after wave, until they were forced to admit something that should have been impossible. They were losing to 35 starving, dehydrated paratroopers. The German commanders weren't stupid. They were veterans. They adjusted tactics. They changed formations. They called for support weapons, mortars, artillery, armor, but every adjustment ran straight into Jake's system. Yes, system, because even though Jake rejected parade discipline and hated army rules, he understood something deeper. You don't win a defensive fight with muscle. You win it with geometry, angles, distance, timing, funneling. Jake wasn't a theorist. He just saw the battlefield with the same instincts he'd used growing up in Oklahoma. Tracking animals, ambushing prey, reading terrain like it was part of his body. The Germans were trained soldiers. Jake's men were hunters, and hunters choose the ground where the kill happens. The night between waves. When the third German assault collapsed, tanks retreating, infantry scattered. The battlefield quieted, smoke hung over the slope. Wounded Germans groaned in the brush. Crows circled overhead, waiting. Jake's men knelt in their shallow dugouts, listening, rifles low, scanning the tree line. They couldn't move bodies. They couldn't risk giving away positions. They couldn't even afford to check on the wounded. Every bullet mattered. Every breath mattered. Every sound mattered. They hadn't eaten properly in days. Their stomachs cramped. Their tongues were dry. Their hands shook, not from fear, but from dehydration. But the hill gave them one thing the Germans didn't have: silence. The Germans below them argued, shouted orders, moved equipment, rallied their wounded, repositioned their machine guns. Jake whispered to his men, "Listen, they're tired too." That gave them enough hope to hold through the night. June 9th, Wave 4. Just after dawn, the Germans tried a different tactic, a concentrated mortar bombardment followed by simultaneous pushes on all three approaches. Jake's men lay completely still as mortar rounds walked across the slope in violent bursts. Chunks of earth flew into the air. Shrapnel ripped leaves off branches overhead. But once again, the Germans miscalculated the angle. The rounds detonated on the forward slope, wasting their energy on empty dirt. Jake shouted, "Hold fire." "Let them come." The Germans advanced carefully this time, ducking low, inching upward. Fire and move techniques, trying to avoid bunching. It didn't matter. Once they reached the folds of terrain Jake had mapped in his head, the American guns opened. The 30 cals spat dense, constant fire. Riflemen picked off anyone who broke cover. Bars erupted in short, punishing bursts. German soldiers dropped in clusters. Some crawled behind rocks so small they barely hit a helmet. Others rolled down slope under fire, arms flailing. The attack dissolved. Another 40 or 50 Germans down. Jake's casualty still 0, Wave 5, panic and desperation. By midday, the German battalion commander had reached a breaking point. His men were demoralized. His officers were shaken. He had artillery support, but nothing that could crack the reverse slope defense Jake had built. So he tried something dangerous. A reckless masked infantry charge up the central approach. Hundreds of Germans surged uphill at once. A screaming, desperate human wave. It was brutal. It was chaotic. It was sloppy, and it was exactly what Jake was waiting for. "Hold," he whispered. His men held hold. The Germans drew closer. Now the hill exploded with American fire. The choke point turned into a blender. German bodies piled so quickly that the dead became obstacles for the living. Men tripping, stumbling, falling into the path of machine gun bursts. Some Germans tried to climb over the piles. Some dropped their rifles and ran. Some charged blindly, firing from the hip, bayonets shaking in their hands. None of it worked. Jake's 35 men were firing with the cold, clean precision of men who had been pushed past hunger and fear into something sharper. A zone where the only thing that existed was the next target. German charge evaporated. The hours that followed, by late afternoon, the battlefield smelled of smoke, wet earth, and cordite. German medics dragged wounded downhill. Officers barked orders no one wanted to follow. Jake's men sat against the dirt walls of their holes, staring down the slope with blank, exhausted eyes. They were hungry, they were thirsty. Their shoulders throbbed from firing rifles for hours. Their ears rang, their fingers were numb, but none of them moved because Jake hadn't told them to move. A runner from the German side approached under another white flag. A second request for surrender. Jake refused to come down the hill. He told the messenger, "Tell your commander we're still here." The messenger nodded. He understood. This wasn't arrogance. This wasn't pride. This was a simple fact. Jake and his men had built a position the Germans could not break. June 10th, the relief. When dawn came on June 10th, the 82nd Airborne finally pushed through German lines. They climbed the hill expecting carnage, dead Americans, blood, spent casings, collapsed trenches. What they found instead were 35 filthy, starving, half-delirious paratroopers still standing. Rifles still loaded. Eyes still locked on the approaches. A relief officer approached Jake. "Report your casualties." Jake wiped mud from his face. 0. The officer blinked. Thought he'd misheard. 0, 0. Jake repeated. "But if you brought food, we'll take it." Behind him, his men laughed weakly. The first real laugh they'd managed in days. The battle was over. The impossible had happened. 35 held off 700, and yet the army still had no idea what Jake was capable of. They would find out in Baston. 6 months after Normandy, most of Jake's original filthy 13 were dead, wounded, or scattered into other units. Only 4 of the original crew remained. Jake had survived a plane explosion, a flooded landing, the bridge assault, and 72 hours of killing to hold a hill against a German battalion. Anyone else would have been rotated out, given a safer assignment, promoted, or at least given time to breathe, but Jake wasn't anyone else. The army had learned something about him. You didn't put him behind a desk. You pointed him at a problem and watched it disappear. And in December 1944, the army's biggest problem was a town called Baston. The Germans launched the counterpunch. On December 16th, the Germans launched a massive winter offensive through the Ardennes, what history would call the Battle of the Bulge. 11,000 American troops in Bastogne were instantly surrounded. No roads open, no wheel, no food, no medicine, no winter gear, no reinforcements. Temperatures dropped below freezing, snow piled knee-deep. German artillery pounded the city day and night. The 101st Airborne Jake's Division was trapped. Supplies were down to scraps. Ammunition was being counted in individual rounds. Medics ran out of morphine. Wounded lay under blankets of snow because there were no bandages left. If Bastogne fell, the Germans would split the Allied line in half. The war would drag on for months. The army needed a miracle. Instead, they got Jake. The impossible ask. Pathfinders, small elite teams who jumped ahead of supply planes to guide them in, were the only chance Bastogne had left. But pathfinding into a surrounded, fog-covered, artillery-soaked city, that wasn't a mission. That was a death sentence. So the call went out. Volunteers only. No one expected Jake McNiss to step forward. He didn't step. He leaped. On December 18th at 3:47 a.m., Jake and 9 other Pathfinders boarded C-47 seconds for a blind jump into a city ringed with anti-aircraft guns. Before jumping, the pilot warned them, "Visibility is 0. Flak is heavy. We can't see the drop zone. This mission shouldn't happen." Jake shrugged. "We've survived worse." The pilot stared. Jake wasn't joking. The jump into the white void at 7:23 a.m. The plane reached Bastogne, but the city was invisible, completely swallowed by fog and smoke. The pilot yelled toward the back, "I can't see the ground." The jump master looked at Jake and his men. "We go anyway." Jake didn't hesitate. He stepped out into a world of white. There was no horizon, no landmarks, no sense of falling, just endless fog swallowing everything. Then boom, the ground hit him like a fist. Jake rolled, stood up, and realized he was in the middle of American lines. Soldiers from the 101st stared at him, stunned. Who the hell jumps into Bastogne right now? Jake brushed snow off his jacket. "Any idea where the Germans are?" The soldier pointed around him in a slow circle. "All around us." Jake nodded. "Good. Saves us time." Finding his men in a dead city, Jake asked where the other Pathfinders landed. "3 of yours landed inside the perimeter. The rest probably outside. Probably dead." Jake refused to accept that. For the next 2 hours, he jogged through ruined streets, dodging incoming artillery, bullets zipping between buildings, searching alleyways, basement, snow drifts. He found one Pathfinder crawling through snow, another hiding behind a collapsed barn, another limping through smoke. By 9:00 a.m., Jake had gathered 8 out of 10. 2 were dead, 8 was enough. Jake split them into 2 teams, one on the east side of the city, one on the west, setting up radio beacons inside shattered buildings on rooftops behind frozen wreckage. If the Germans triangulated their signal, they'd bombard them instantly, so the teams bounced signals between each other to disguise exact locations. This was threading a needle in a hurricane. The first drop. At 10:17 a.m., Jake made his first radio call. "Bisson to Allied Command. We are surrounded. We are holding. Request immediate resupply." The reply came faster than expected. "Supplies en route. Hold signal steady." At 11:34 a.m., the first C-47 broke through the clouds, flying so low the treetops shook. German flak erupted instantly. Shells burst around the plane, but the pilot kept coming. He kicked supply bundles out of the bay, food, ammo, medicine, and somehow survived the climbout. The bundles landed inside American lines. Jake exhaled for the first time in hours. It worked. The 24-hour lifeline. Jake called in another drop, then another, then another. The fog never lifted. Artillery never stopped. German snipers fired at shapes in the white. Flak guns blasted at shadows in the sky. But the C-47 seconds kept coming. Guided solely by the weak beacons Jake's teams kept alive. Pilots flew so low that men on the ground could see frost forming on the wings. Jake and his Pathfinders stayed awake through the entire night, adjusting signals, relocating equipment, dodging bombs, coordinating drop after drop. By December 20th at 10:17 a.m., they had accomplished something thought impossible. 247 successful resupply drops, thousands of pounds of ammunition, thousands of pounds of rations, crates of medical supplies, winter gear, radio batteries, fuel cans, bandages, everything Baston needed to survive. Thanks to Jake, the 101st Airborne kept fighting. They held the line. They refused to surrender. And when General Patton's tanks finally broke through to relieve the city on December 26th, the men of Baston were still alive because of Jake. No medal, no ceremony, no credit. Pathfinder operations were classified. No one outside a tiny circle knew what Jake had done. He didn't get a medal. He didn't get a ceremony. He didn't get a promotion. He didn't care. He had kept 11,000 American soldiers alive, and to Jake that was enough. When Germany finally collapsed in May 1945, Jake should have come home a celebrated hero. He had survived D-Day, held a bridge against impossible odds, saved Baston with 247 supply drops, and completed 4 combat jumps that killed most men who attempted even one. Instead, the Army sent him into Germany with the 101st Airborne for occupation duty. For the first time in 4 years, Jake wasn't fighting, he wasn't killing, he wasn't being shot at, and that's when the real trouble started. What do you do with a man who only knows war? Jake and his men occupied a region filled with abandoned Nazi estates, mansions, and looted wealth. One of those estates belonged to Hermann Goering, Hitler's second in command. Inside, liquor cabinets worth fortunes, stolen race horses, silk, jewelry, paintings, gold. Jake and the surviving filthy 13 did what any men who had cheated death for 4 straight years would do. They threw a party. They rode Goering's racehorses through open fields. They drank his expensive liquor straight from the bottles. They held a makeshift rodeo in the courtyard of a Nazi palace. Jake wasn't celebrating victory, he was celebrating survival. During that chaos, Jake met a German woman named Amelia. She liked him immediately. He liked her more than he expected. Later, Jake discovered her father had been the local head of the Hitler Youth. Jake laughed. Nothing about war made sense anymore. Not enemies, not loyalties, not anything. After years of killing, Jake couldn't tell where the lines were supposed to be drawn. The Army finally lets him go. Eventually, Jake was sent back to Arkansas for medical evaluations. He had been running his body on instinct for 4 years, and the cracks were showing. While recovering, he got into yet another fight with MP. This time, he threatened the MP commander directly, telling him that once he became a civilian, he'd come settle things properly. That was the final straw. The Army didn't court-martial him. They didn't punish him. They simply discharged him. Honorable discharge, 3 years, 5 months, 26 days of service, 4 combat jumps, hundreds of confirmed kills, never promoted past private. The Army didn't know whether to shake his hand or be relieved. He was gone. Jake didn't care. He was done. He went home to Oklahoma, and almost immediately the war followed him. The battle with no uniform. Jake drank a lot. He drank because it dulled the noise in his head, because it blurred the memories of screaming men, burning planes, freezing nights, and bodies piled on hillsides. He drank because sleep brought nightmares, and waking up brought silence so heavy it felt like drowning. No one around him understood. No one wanted to understand. They wanted him to be normal, a neighbor, a husband, a father. But Jake had spent 4 years as a weapon. Turning that off isn't simple. Turning that off without help is nearly impossible. His life spiraled until 1951, when he wrapped his car around a telephone pole in a drunk driving accident so violent that doctors said he should have died instantly. He woke up in a hospital bed 3 days later, his skull fractured, ribs broken, lungs bruised, and for the first time since the war, he saw himself clearly. He had survived a plane explosion. He had survived German artillery. He had survived Baston. He had survived all the impossible things that killed better men, and here he was killing himself slowly in peacetime. That night, Jake made a decision that would change the rest of his life. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a religious vision. It wasn't a dramatic epiphany. He simply decided, if I'm still alive, maybe I'm supposed to do something better than this. He quit drinking cold, immediate, permanent. 6 months later, he married Mary Catherine, a local Oklahoma girl. She knew he had served. She knew he had jumped into France, but she didn't know the details. Jake never told her. He never told anyone. He didn't want his children growing up believing that war was heroic. He didn't want them worshipping violence. He didn't want them thinking that killing, no matter how justified, was something to admire. So he built a different life. He worked at the Panka City Post Office, sorted mail, sold stamps, coached Little League, went to church every Sunday, raised 3 children who had no idea their father had once held off 7.